You've come to the right place today. You've come here on the right day. That's a logistical reassurance, but it's also a recognition of the significance of this week and the weekend that follows it. This is the end of an unprecedented week of mobilization around climate change. Between the 20th of September and the 27th, which is to say yesterday, that's right, more than 7 million people have turned out globally to demand action on climate change at gatherings around the world. It swamps any previous public action related to any environmental cause. According to Bill McKibben's 350.org, it included more than 6,000 separate actions, one of which was here in Salina, Kansas, organized by our interns. Spread across 185 countries, truly a global mobilization. Maybe Bill will have more updates on the latest stats when he's with us tomorrow. So our gathering here is, in a sense, truly auspicious. On the other hand, our gathering is at a time of unprecedented peril from climate change, at least unprecedented without turning to geological time to find a comparison. I'm going to turn for a minute to the special report that the IPCC released late last year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Human activities from the industrial era to now have already caused a full degree Celsius of warming. This warming, quote, will persist for centuries to millennia and will continue to cause further long-term changes in the climate system, such as sea level rises. So this is the climate change that here today, as we sit, that we're locked into, even if the smokestacks go dry today. The report continues. Global warming is likely to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius between 2030, which is the year that my older child turns 18, and 2052, between those years, if it continues to increase at its current rate. The impacts that are mentioned in the report, most of them with the phrase high confidence in parentheses behind them, include higher average temperatures almost everywhere in the world, quote, hot extremes in most inhabited regions, end quote, excessive rainfall in some places, droughts in others. These impacts apply to plants, to insects, to vertebrates, and the rather chilling phrase is present, transformation of ecosystems from one type to another. In an understated sentence, to say the least, climate-related risks to health, livelihoods, food security, water supply, human security, and economic growth are projected to increase. Translation, broken lives and broken ecosystems. To avoid overshoot, the report continues, global carbon dioxide emissions must decrease by about half by 2030, the year my son turns 18, and hit net zero by 2050. In a less understated sentence, the report says, quote, this will require rapid and far-reaching transitions in energy, land, urban infrastructure, and industrial systems. These systems transitions are unprecedented in terms of scale. I want us to sit with this for a minute here. I think sometimes many of us get caught up with the idea that we're card-carrying believers in climate science, right? I'm not sure that in the midst of our pride in that status, we always fully process the implications of the science that we're so proud in believing. Changes are coming, my friends. That's a reality. When we were naming this year's theme, Carbon, Culture, and Change from the ground up, we, of course, did the good compositional thing and set up an alliteration at the beginning and had to choose our C words. In some ways, it would have been most natural to choose climate to lead off with this, but we didn't choose climate. We chose carbon. Carbon is very literally the stuff of life. Our bodies are 2/3 water, But after that, the remainder is almost entirely organic compounds, carbon compounds. We are made of carbon. We take carbon in every day, and we breathe carbon out every second. So it's ironic that we've managed to get ourselves into a situation where the word carbon is fraught. It's attached, half understood, to an approaching danger. Maybe some of our confusion in grasping what's going on here is our difficulty grasping the time scales that are involved in these mass flows of carbon in our bodies, on our planet, in our universe. Now we learn what patient periods must round themselves before the rock is formed and then before the rock is broken, as Emerson once wrote. Emerson wrote an essay on geology. Did you know that? What Emerson didn't know, and you might say he didn't know the half of it at the time, is that geology is just the start of our exploration. As Wes Jackson is fond of reminding us, all of this carbon and most of the other elements in the universe were formed in the hearts of dying stars at the beginning of the universe. I wasn't there, so I can't vouch for it, but with all this book learning that we've accumulated on carbon cycles and carbon flows, we're still struggling to adapt the rhythms of our lives with the rhythms of this carbon cycle. On a time scale of months and years and decades, solar radiation arrives on our planet. Plants harness some of it to reduce atmospheric carbon to biomass. Later, the plants oxidize carbon back out when they decay or are digested. On a scale of tens of millions and hundreds of millions of years, sometimes a whole bunch of that organic matter gets trapped deep underground and removed from circulation. We call that fossil fuels. On a time scale of decades and centuries, we come along, stick a straw down into that trapped carbon, light it on fire, and then act all surprised about the results. We're still grappling a little bit with time scales. And that brings us to culture. It's arguably what makes our species distinctive among all of our carbon-based companions here on this globe. Around 1740, Alexander Pope wrote, where grows it not? If vain our toil, we ought to blame the culture and not the soil." Now, the word culture, of course, has been in constant motion. For example, in 1740, it was still more closely associated with farming, with agriculture, than it was with a broad system of human beliefs and norms and behaviors. But it was on its way. The content of those norms and behaviors that it describes now have been in motion too. And too often our culture has focused us on extraction and domination of the earth and of one another. Naomi Klein, in her latest book that came out less than 2 weeks ago, has a very memorable phrase for the latest version of this dual extraction and domination system. She calls it the gig and dig economy. At the same time, of course, and this is part of what we're here to celebrate every year, at the same time, culture can be a source of grace and resilience for us. So there's some urgency now to round off the rough parts of our culture and to shine up the smooth parts. It's time to put culture back to work for the ecosphere and for the human beings who are part of it. So finally, change. I suspect some of the talks that follow are going to reference the great difficulty of working change in human affairs. And in many senses, they'll be precisely right. But the irony of all this is that if there's any one thing that we've demonstrated that we're good at, it's change. We have a proclivity for change. We change seemingly every generation or two our agriculture, we change our transportation, our industry, our information processing, our communications, our leisure time. So far, every change, the energy intensivity goes up. So the bad news is that our proclivity for change is exactly what got us into this. The good news is, and that the lessons of history are that we are not lacking in a capacity for reinvention. And that's something like many turns of the wheel of life, that our flaws turn around to be our attributes. So carbon, culture, and change, one might say, are the three things that make us human. And so as we move into the time to come here this weekend, I'm going to give you three human paradoxes to ponder here. The first, climate action versus climate justice. On the one hand, the proximate forces causing climate change are forces of physics and engineering and chemistry and biology. So some might say, do we have time to look elsewhere? Do we have time right now for concerns of social justice? Do we have time for fighting racism and sexism, for elevating the status of indigenous peoples? Don't we need to focus on proximate causes and proximate solutions? On the other hand, everything that we know about the world, human and natural, that we live in is that our Earth domination complex is tightly intertwined with our people domination complex. Sometimes this is used against us, exploiting prejudices and inequalities to stop action. Sometimes we sabotage our own action by failing to consult the wisdom of everyone around us, including marginalized communities. So maybe the real question is, do we have time right now not to fight for social justice? As we might phrase it at the Land Institute, do we not have time for a focus on people, land, and community alike? Second paradox, do we cut the fossil fuels or do we soak up the carbon? On the one hand, the preponderance of greenhouse gas emissions, the preponderance of the problem, comes from burning fossil fuels. So maybe we should focus very tightly there and exclusively work on renewable energy and energy efficiency. On the other hand, maybe what we need is really a good source of negative emissions, a solution that actively pulls carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But in truth, the climate problem is so large that we might say we need both, with a big side of reduced demand also. You're about to hear in a few minutes a superb speaker on the renewables and efficiency side of this work. And then, and I don't want to give too much of a spoiler, but here at the Land Institute, we might have an idea or two for a biological pathway to negative emissions. Third paradox, fast versus slow. On the one hand, climate change demands rapid solutions like no other human problem ever had. You heard the IPCC report. We need to generate substantial reductions in greenhouse gas emissions immediately. So right now, clearly we do not have time for slow solutions. On the other hand, some of the rapid solutions that we pursue fall into a category that's also known as quick fixes. And the culture of the quick fix is arguably a big part of how we got to this point. So what we need is fast and decisive action on truly transformational solutions. Some of these, like fundamental changes in how we produce and consume energy, have the technical potential to be fast, to be rapid solutions. Others, like perennializing our grain crop agriculture, are by necessity slow projects. I let the spoiler slip out there. Sorry to ruin your suspense about the biological pathway. So just as the gravity of the climate change situation tells us we don't have time to work slowly, maybe the gravity of the climate change situation also tells us that we do not have time for quick fixes. More on this tomorrow. So a story for you here. When I was about 7 years old, about the same age my son is now, and my grandfather was about 67 years old, he planted a California redwood in his front yard. Now, this is a tree that isn't considered fully mature until it's 500 years old. Can you imagine the audacity and the vision and the commitment to the future of planting a California redwood at age 67? Maybe there's a lesson for us there. Now, in a coda to this story, when I was about 11 and my grandfather was about 71, the tree died. And it may be because if you know anything about California redwoods, they don't grow in west central Illinois. So the quality of our vision, we're reminded, maybe matters in addition to the scope. Now, in fairness to my grandfather, he was well aware that that was the likely outcome. He just wanted to see what would happen. He had sized up the situation. He knew he was putting nothing significant at risk by planting that tree, and so he proceeded, which is not a bad way of being. But for us, in our time and the topic we're talking about, there's a bit more at risk behind the decisions that we make or fail to make right now. So what are we going to do? Next move. In the first Prairie Festival that I attended ever in 2001, September of 2001, there was some risk in the air. As I now know, there was a real possibility that it wouldn't be possible to mount that Prairie Festival in that particular month of that particular year. But in the face of air travel confusion, canceled registrations, canceled speakers, a cloud of national tension, the show went on right here in this barn. One of the speakers was Mari Dietrich, a farmer from Clyde, who also carries the distinction of being the first person to preside over the Land Institute's board, whose last name wasn't Jackson. Mari may be here. Are you here somewhere, Mari? Yeah, up in the VIP section up there. Yeah, well, you could really clap after this. We'll clap now and later. So with a little help from our archives, I can tell you that one of the things that Mari said on that day, 18 years ago, is this. She said, "Truth is entered through the twin portals of paradox and confusion." You remember this? If we wish to take this path, we have no choice but to live with tension and complexity. And then she went on to end, above all, live the life you have been given. And so as we embark into the next day and a half, my sending in to you is that this is a time to sit with some tension and complexity, and it's a celebration of the lives we've been given. Thank you for being here.